The wind off the Nebraska plain never really stopped. It just changed its mind about how hard to blow. Edna Voss had learned that in the first winter after she and her husband, Reuben, came west. She had been 22 years old then, standing outside a dugout that smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, watching the grass bend in long silver waves toward the horizon. Reuben had put his arm around her shoulders and said that the wind was just the land talking. She had told him the land had very poor manners. He had laughed. That was 41 years ago. Now Reuben was 4 months in the ground, and Edna Voss, 63 years old, gray-haired, wide-shouldered, with hands that had kneaded bread and hauled water and delivered calves and buried two children of her own before burying her husband, stood in the August heat outside a different dugout entirely. This one was not hers. This one belonged to nobody anymore. Half the sod roof had caved inward. The door hung from a single leather hinge. The windmill behind it had shed two of its wooden blades and stood crooked against the sky like a man who had given up trying to stand straight. Beside her stood her grandson Clement, 8 years old, small for his age, with Reuben's dark eyes and his mother's habit of going quiet when the world became too large to understand. His mother was gone. His father, too. Fever had taken them the previous winter, 1 week apart, with a mercilessness that seemed almost deliberate. What the fever left behind was Clem and what remained of a farmstead that no longer belonged to Edna Voss in any way that a court of law would recognize. She looked at the broken windmill. She looked at the collapsed roof. She looked at the grass stretching south and west in every direction without a single tree to interrupt it. 12 miles north was Imperial, the county seat. It had a general store, a land office, a blacksmith, and a railroad that would not arrive for another 6 years. It did not have anything that could help her right now. 12 miles south of Imperial was this: a dead man's claim, a pile of sod bricks rotting back into the earth, a dry well, a cast iron stove too heavy for any single person to move, sitting inside the collapsed dugout like the only honest thing left on the property. And at the edge of the eastern fence line, stretching for 50 yards in both directions, a wall of dried tumbleweed 8 feet high. Conrad Webb's wagon was already gone. She had not watched it leave. She had been looking at the dugout when she heard the wheels begin to roll, and she had made a decision in that moment not to turn around, not to give him the satisfaction of watching her watch him go. She had known Conrad Webb for 11 years, known him the way you know a stone in your boot, by the specific and persistent discomfort of his presence. He had been Reuben's business partner in a grain brokerage that Reuben had built from nothing over the course of a decade, and when Reuben died in April, Conrad Webb had arrived at the farmhouse 3 days after the burial with a sheaf of papers that he spread across the kitchen table with the careful patience of a man who had been preparing for this moment for some time. Edna had not understood every word of what those papers said, but she had understood enough. The partnership agreement, as Conrad explained it with his hands folded and his voice carrying the particular gentleness of a man delivering news he expected to profit from, gave the surviving partner full operational control in the event of the other partner's death. This was standard practice, he said. Reuben had signed it years ago. He showed her the signature. She recognized Reuben's handwriting. She did not recognize the clause Conrad was pointing to, because the clause, she would later understand, had not been there when Reuben signed. But she could not prove that. She had no lawyer. She had no copy of the original agreement. She had Reuben's word, and Reuben was in the ground on the eastern hill behind the barn, and his word died with him. What she had was Clem and 31 cents in a cloth purse and 14 months of labor that Conrad Webb acknowledged with a nod, and then subtracted from what he called her outstanding debt for room and board during the period of her residence on what was now legally his property. The farmstead, the grain operation, the cattle, all of it. She had refused to understand it at first. Then she had refused to accept it. Then she had sat at that kitchen table for a very long time after Conrad left, listening to Clem breathe in the next room, and she had done what she always did when the numbers were bad. She had started counting what she actually had: 31 cents, one grandson 8 years old, the clothes on their backs, a wool blanket, a cookpot, and Conrad Webb's offer, his generous, magnanimous, deeply poisonous offer, to sign over the deed to an abandoned quarter section 12 miles south of Imperial, which a family named Hendricks had homesteaded and then abandoned the previous spring. He had framed it as a kindness, a gesture of goodwill toward Reuben's widow. She had looked at him across the kitchen table of the home she had kept for 30 years and understood in the way you understand a thing, your body knows, for your mind catches up exactly what he was doing. He was not giving her land. He was giving her a place to die. Conrad Webb knew Nebraska winters. He had survived 6 of them. He knew that a woman of 63 and a child of 8, alone on an abandoned claim, with no tools, no food stores, no fuel, and no shelter, worth the name would not last until Christmas. He knew that the prairie would do his work for him. He would not have to lift a finger. He would not have to feel responsible. He had given her land, hadn't he? He had been generous. Whatever happened next was not his doing. She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said yes, because 31 cents and a dead man's claim were still more than nothing. And nothing was the only other option he was offering. The wagon had rolled away, the dust had settled, and Edna Voss Nell, as Reuben had always called her, as Clem called her now, stood in the August heat outside a collapsed dugout and began to count what she actually had. The dugout had 3 walls of packed earth and 1 of sod bricks. The roof was mostly gone, but the stove was there, and 3 joints of rusted stovepipe. The door could be rehung. The sod walls, though crumbling, still stood. She had the wool blanket and the cookpot and the 31 cents. She had Clem, who was looking at her with Reuben's eyes and waiting to see what she would do next. She walked the quarter section that afternoon while Clem sat in the shade of the broken windmill. The grass ran waist-high in places. She found the well dry, the rope rotted away. She found the remains of a garden choked with weeds. She found the outline of where a proper sod house had been started and then abandoned the unfinished bricks already dissolving back into the soil. And she found the tumbleweed. She had always hated it. Every homesteader hated it. Russian thistle, the old-timers called it. It had come out from the east with German-Russian settlers a decade before, and it had spread across the Great Plains, the way bad news spread faster than anyone thought possible. Stopping for nothing, caring about nothing, seeding itself into every plowed field and fence line and dry creek bed from Kansas to the Dakota Territory. A single plant dropped 200,000 seeds. It clogged wells. It tangled in fences. It was, as Reuben had said more than once, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has pulled the same weed 1,000 times, the most useless thing God ever allowed to grow. But it had grown here. It had grown here in enormous quantities, piling against the eastern fence line over years of abandonment until the drift was 8 feet high in places and stretched in both directions as far as she could see. Thousands of the dead skeletal plants dried to the color of old bone, tangled together into masses so dense they looked almost solid. She stopped and looked at them for a while. Then she kept walking because she did not have a thought yet. Just a faint awareness, the way you become aware of a sound before you can identify what is making it. She walked for 3 hours. When she came back to the dugout, her knees were aching badly, and her left hip was doing the thing it had started doing 2 winters ago, a deep grinding complaint that Reuben had rubbed liniment into on bad nights. There was no liniment now. There was no Reuben. She sat down at the base of the fence line beside the tumbleweed pile because it was the only thing near enough to lean against. She let her weight fall back against the mass of dried plants. They gave slightly and then held her a dense, scratchy compression, nothing like comfort, but sufficient. The wind was blowing. It had been blowing all afternoon, the kind of steady August wind that made the grass hiss and the broken windmill creak and the dust rise off the dry ground in thin spirals. She was accustomed to it. You stopped hearing it after a while on the Nebraska plain, the way you stopped hearing a clock tick. But she noticed after a few minutes that she could not feel it. The wind was there. She could hear it. She could see the grass moving 20 feet away, the long silver undulation of it against the afternoon sky. But against her back, where the tumbleweed pressed against her coat, there was nothing. No movement, no chill. The air inside the dense tangle of dried branches was completely perfectly still. She reached behind her and pushed her hand into the mass. The thorns pricked her palm through the glove. She pushed deeper. 6 inches and 8 inches a foot. The wind vanished entirely. The air inside the pile was not warm exactly, but it was still. Dead still. The kind of stillness you found in a root cellar in July, or in a haymow in December, or in the space between 2 sleeping bodies on the coldest night of the year. She sat there with her hand inside the tumbleweed pile and let herself remember. Reuben had told her once early in their first winter together why a barn full of cattle stayed warmer than an empty one. Not because the cattle generated enough heat to matter, he had said, but because still air holds temperature and moving air strips it away. The cattle's bodies interrupted the airflow. The hay did the same thing. The thick walls of the dugout did it. Any dense material that stopped the air from moving could hold whatever warmth existed inside it. Reuben had learned this from his father, who had learned it from his father, who had crossed from Pennsylvania in a wagon and built his first shelter out of whatever he could lay hands on, because there was no other choice. She had been 22 years old when Reuben told her this, standing in that first dugout with the smell of wood smoke and wet earth, and she had filed the information away, the way you file away facts that seem interesting but not immediately useful. It had lived in her memory for 41 years, gathering dust. Now she pulled it out and looked at it. The tumbleweed pile was 8 feet high and 50 yards long. It was, as she had always known, completely worthless. It could not be burned for fuel because it flared and died too quickly. It could not be used for fencing because it crumbled under pressure. It could not be eaten. It could not be sold. It was by every practical measure the most useless material on the plains. Except that it was also, by the same physical principle Reuben had explained in their first winter, a near-perfect insulator. The thousands of interlocking branches created an infinite series of tiny air pockets. If those pockets could be compressed tightly enough, densely enough that the air trapped inside them could not circulate, they would slow the transfer of heat the way a haymow slowed it, the way earth slowed it, the way 6 inches of sod brick slowed it. She pulled her hand out of the pile and looked at her palm. The thorns had left a fine crosshatch of red marks. She looked at the drift of tumbleweed stretching in both directions. Then she looked at the collapsed dugout. Then she looked at the sky, which was still August blue, which would be October gray in 6 weeks, and January white in 5 months. She did not have a plan, not yet. What she had was the beginning of a direction. She stood up slowly, letting her hips settle into the new position, and walked back to the dugout where Clem was waiting. 3 days later, Lars Holmgren rode up on a plow horse. He was 65 years old and built like something that had been assembled for function rather than comfort, barrel-chested, thick through the shoulders, with a gray beard that reached his collar, and the hands of a man who had spent 40 years arguing with the soil. He had homesteaded 3 miles east since 1880, which meant he had survived 6 Nebraska winters. He had also in that time buried his only son and his daughter-in-law to diphtheria, a fact that had carved something permanent into the set of his face. He came because Conrad Webb had told him about the woman and the boy at the Hendricks place. He came because 6 winters had taught him that unprepared neighbors became problems, and problems on the Nebraska plain had a way of becoming fatal ones. He dismounted and walked the perimeter of the dugout without speaking. He looked at the collapsed roof. He looked at the stove Nell had dragged into the open air to clean the rust off it. He looked at Clem, who was stacking dried cow chips into a careful pyramid beside the windmill, with the focused attention of a child who has learned to make useful things out of whatever is available. Lars watched the boy for a moment. His expression shifted into something difficult to read. "Conrad told me you were here," he said. "Said you'd be in the ground by November." "Conrad says a lot of things," Nell said. Lars looked at her directly. He had the kind of eyes that assessed rather than simply saw, the eyes of a man who had learned to measure risk the way a carpenter measures lumber, because the cost of being wrong was too high to risk sentiment. "He's not wrong about winter," Lars said. He walked her through it, then the way a man who respects a thing by naming it will walk you through the specific facts of a danger. The winter of 1880, the first bad one when snow came in October and did not stop until May. The Anderson family, 2 claims south of his, who had burned their furniture, and then their fencing, and then their barn trying to stay warm and frozen anyway, all 3 of them found stiff as fence posts with the cattle dead around them. The fuel problem: a proper homestead needed 3 to 5 cords of wood for winter, and there was no wood to speak of on the open plain. Twisted hay, corn cobs, buffalo chips. That was what the plains offered, and the buffalo were gone now, and the chips Clem was stacking would not last 3 weeks. Nell listened. She had heard versions of this before from Reuben, from neighbors, from her own body on cold mornings. She was not dismissing it. "Come work for me," Lars said. He said it the way a man says a thing he believes is reasonable. "My wife needs help. You'd have food and shelter." Wages eventually. The boy too. Nell looked at him. As household help. As household help, yes. She had spent 40 years building something of her own. She had spent 14 months as household help in a house that Conrad Webb had taken from her. She understood what household help meant in practice. It meant eating last, sleeping in the lean-to, existing at the sufferance of people who owed you nothing and whose goodwill was the only thing standing between you and the road. I'll file a claim, she said. This quarter section. The Hendricks walked off it so the title should be clear. The law allows a head of household to file. I qualify. Lars looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass between them. The law allows it, he said. Winter doesn't. He mounted his horse. He looked at Clem, then back at her, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped slightly as if he were saying something he did not want to say but felt obligated to. The boy didn't choose this. Don't kill him trying to prove a point. He rode east. Nell watched until he was gone. Clem came to stand beside her. The shadows were getting long across the ruined dugout, and the air had the first faint edge of something cooler in it, the early reminder that August was already counting down. Are we going to die? Clem asked. No, she said. How do you know? She did not know. But she had learned in 63 years that the answer to that particular question was not the truth. The answer was the direction you chose to move in. Go stack more chips, she said. We'll need every one. She began the next morning. The dugout floor was her first problem. Earth insulated, but only if you were below the frost line, and the existing floor was only a foot down. She needed to go deeper, 2 feet more, maybe 3, to get the living space below the point where winter cold could reach through the soil walls from above. She had no spade. She had no tools of any kind except the pocket knife she had kept in her coat pocket for 20 years, the one Reuben had given her after she complained that women were always expected to need help opening things. She walked to the Holmgren farm that morning. Sigrid Holmgren answered the door, a spare gray woman of 60 with level eyes and the particular economy of movement that comes from decades of doing everything that needs doing without anyone to help you do it. Nell asked to borrow a spade. Sigrid looked at her for a moment. Then she disappeared inside and came back with a spade worn smooth at the handle but solid. My son's, she said. He won't need it. Nell took it. Thank you. I'll return it. Sigrid nodded. She looked at Nell with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite admiration, but was something in the vicinity of both. What else? She asked. Nell hesitated. The next part would sound strange. Do you know where I might find chicken wire, the hexagonal kind? Sigrid frowned. The store in Imperial carries some, 50 cents a roll. I can't buy it, Nell said, but I can work for it. She thanked Sigrid and walked back to the claim with the spade over her shoulder. 12 miles to Imperial, 12 miles back. She had done it before. She would do it again. But first she needed to dig. She started that afternoon. The earth was baked hard by August's sun. Each thrust of the spade required her full weight on the footbar, and the ground gave up its inches grudgingly a few cubic feet at a time. Clem helped when he could, loading the loose dirt into the cookpot and hauling it outside in trip after trip, his small legs working steadily back and forth without complaint. By sunset, they had gone down 6 inches. Nell's palms had blistered and broken. She wrapped them in strips torn from the blanket's edge and kept the spade moving. 3 days later, the floor was 18 inches lower. The air at the bottom of the excavation felt different, cooler, more stable, with the particular quality of earth temperature that does not shift with the weather above it. She stood at the bottom of the pit and felt the difference through the soles of her boots. It was on the 4th day that Dorothea Paxton appeared. She came on a mule riding up from the southwest with no announcement of any kind, and sat on the mule at the edge of the excavation for a long time without speaking, watching Nell work. She was 54 years old, younger than Nell by nearly a decade, with sun-weathered skin and dark eyes that moved over everything they looked at, with the careful thoroughness of a woman who had learned that overlooking things had consequences. Her husband had died the previous winter of a fever. She had dug his grave herself because the ground was too frozen for anyone else to reach in time. She kept chickens, sold eggs to the Imperial store, and ran her claim 3 miles southwest with the focused self-containment of someone who had stopped waiting for help and simply become help itself. Lars Holmgren had told her about the woman at the Hendricks place. She had listened and said nothing, which was her custom, and then she had ridden over to see for herself. Malars said you were either stubborn or stupid, she said, and he couldn't figure out which. What did you tell him? Nell said, not stopping. I told him I'd come have a look. She dismounted and walked to the edge of the excavation. She looked at the depth of it. She looked at the way the walls had been cut vertical and clean, with the corners squared as well as a pocket knife could manage. Lowering the floor helps with heat retention, she said. You know that. I know it, Nell said. You can't repair the sod bricks. They've been wet too many times. The grass roots are dead. I know that too. So what are you building? Nell set the spade down. She pointed toward the fence line. Those. Dorothea Paxton looked at the wall of tumbleweed. Then she looked back at Nell. Her expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, the look of a person who has been surprised by an idea that they are not yet sure whether to dismiss or consider. Nell explained it. The principle of still air. The double layer of chicken wire with the tumbleweed compressed between them, packed tightly enough that the air inside could not circulate, creating a shell of insulation all the way around the living space. The mud seals at every joint. The excavated floor below, frost reach. The willow pole frame bent into a dome to distribute the weight. Dorothea listened to all of it. Tumbleweed is a fire hazard, she said when Nell finished. Loose tumbleweed is. Compressed material doesn't burn the same way. No air movement means no flame to feed. You're building a house out of weeds and wire. I'm building shelter out of what I have. Another long silence. Dorothea looked at Clem, who was sitting against the broken windmill with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap, watching the adults with the particular stillness of a child who has learned not to interrupt conversations that matter. How old is the boy? 8. Dorothea looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at Nell, and her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but carrying something underneath the skepticism, something that had the texture of experience recognized. I have chicken wire, she said. Trap pieces left over from my coop. Not enough for what you're describing, but some. I'll bring it by tomorrow. Why? Nell said. It was a real question, not a challenge. She had learned in 63 years not to accept help without understanding what it cost. Dorothea gathered her reins. Because I remember what it felt like to have nothing and need everything. And because if you die out here, I don't want to spend the rest of my life thinking about whether I could have done something. She turned the mule. I still think you're going to freeze. She rode southwest without looking back. 2 weeks passed, the tumbleweed walls began to rise. Nell walked to Imperial and back 12 miles each way and worked a week for the general store owner, sweeping floors and hauling freight in exchange for 2 rolls of chicken wire. She carried them home on her shoulders in the dark, the wire cutting into her collarbone, through her coat, stopping every mile to rest and then starting again, because stopping for too long meant the pain in her hip would stiffen and become something that required more will than she currently had to push through. She drove willow poles cut on 2 round trips to a creek bed 8 miles south into the ground at 2-foot intervals around the perimeter of the excavated pit, bending them inward and lashing the tops together with strips of wet rawhide that would shrink tight as they dried. The frame rose in overlapping arches, each one bracing the next, until she had a dome-shaped skeleton 8 feet high at the peak. She wrapped the outer layer of wire, first attaching it to the poles with nails bent into U-shapes. Then she began packing the tumbleweed. Each plant had to be compressed by hand, the branching stems forced together until the mass was dense enough to resist the wind. She wore strips of blanket around her palms to protect against the thorns, but the thorns found gaps. By the end of the first day, her hands looked like she had reached into a blackberry thicket in the dark. By the end of the first week, the cuts had scabbed and split open and scabbed again enough times that she stopped, feeling individual thorns, and simply felt her hands as a general condition of discomfort to be managed. She packed the tumbleweed between the outer wire layer and an inner layer. She erected a foot inside it, creating a shell of compressed plant material 12 inches thick. The dome grew darker as the layers thickened. Clem helped where he could, handing materials, carrying water, doing the 100 small tasks that a construction project generates, and that would have been lost hours without a second pair of hands. She sealed the gaps between wire and foundation with mud mixed from clay. She dug near the dry well. The mud dried and cracked. She applied more mud. It cracked again. She began mixing dried grass into the mud to give it fiber, the way she had seen adobe described in a book once, and the cracking slowed. On the 14th of September, Conrad Webb came back. He came in the late afternoon with two men she recognized from the Imperial Storeland, speculators out of Culbertson, men with the particular patience of people who knew how to wait for things to get desperate before they made their move. They rode up and stopped at a distance, and Conrad dismounted alone and walked around the half-finished dome with his hands in his coat pockets, his face carrying that careful blankness that expensive intentions were as camouflage. He did not touch anything. He looked for a long time at the wire frame, the packed tumbleweed walls, the mud seals, the willow pole skeleton visible at the peak where the outer layer was not yet complete. "This is something," he said finally. "It's shelter," Nell said. "It's a pile of weeds." He looked at the fence line, then back at the dome. "You know what happens if that catches fire? One ember from the stove, one knocked over lantern. The whole structure goes in 30 seconds. Compressed material doesn't burn that way. Everything burns." He looked at her without hostility, without warmth, with the flat assessment of a man calculating odds. "You haven't filed yet. I checked the land office. You're squatting on an abandoned claim. Anyone with $14 can file on it." Nell felt the number land. She had not known about the filing fee. Conrad saw it in her face. He was a man who watched faces the way a card player watches hands, and he had spent enough time around Nell to read her well. $14, he said, "which you don't have, which you can't earn before winter because winter is coming and you're going to spend every hour between now and November trying not to die." He stepped closer. His voice dropped to the register of a man offering mercy. "Take $12 for your quit claim. Walk to Imperial. Buy passage to Culbertson on the freight wagon. Then take the train somewhere warm. Start over somewhere that makes sense." "And Clem," she said, "the boy can come back to me. He's too young to manage the trip alone. I'll place him with a proper family." "The way you place livestock," she said, "when the price is right." Conrad's expression did not change. "I'm offering you a way out." "No," Nell said. "You're offering me what you offered me before. A way to disappear quietly so you don't have to think about what you did." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. "When I file on this claim in January," he said as he mounted, "I'll make sure someone buries you proper, if there's enough left to bury." He rode away with the speculators. The dust rose behind them and then settled, and there was only the grass and the wind and the half-finished dome rising behind her against the pale September sky. Nell sat down in the grass. She put her hands on her knees and looked at the ground between her boots. $14, she had 31 cents. She had the dome that was not yet finished and the winter that was already beginning to feel its way into the nights, and a grandson who was 8 years old and had already lost more than a child should lose before he understood what loss meant. She sat there long enough for the sun to move a noticeable distance across the scape. Then Clem came out of the dome entrance and sat down beside her. He did not ask questions. He had learned in the months since his parents died that there were conversations that happened in silence. He leaned his shoulder against hers, warm and solid and alive, and they sat together in the wind while the evening light turned the half-finished dome gold. "Bah," he said, using the word he had used for her since he was old enough to say it. Then he switched to English the way he always did when he was being careful. "Grandma, it's warmer inside now, even without the stove." She lifted her head, looked at the dome. At the walls that were already two-thirds finished, the tumbleweed compressed tight between the wire layers the mud seals holding. "We're not done," she said. "I know." He looked at the dome too, "but it's starting to work." She put her arm around his shoulders. He was small under her arm. He weighed almost nothing. He was the last thing Reuben had left in the world and the first thing she was going to get through this winter, and the only reason she needed to have a plan. "Yes," she said, "it is." The sun dropped below the flat line of the western horizon, and the temperature fell with it the way it always did on the plains, fast, unapologetic, without transition. Inside the dome, the air was still. Outside, in every direction, the grass moved in long waves, counting down the weeks until January. She had 31 cents. She had a dome that was not finished. She had a $14 problem with no solution she could see yet. And she had 63 years of knowing that solutions you could not see yet were not the same as solutions that did not exist. She stood up, helped Clem to his feet. There was still light enough to work. October arrived the way bad news arrives, not all at once, but in increments, each one worse than the last, each one preparing you for the next without making it any easier to bear. The first frost came on the 3rd of the month. Nell woke before dawn to find the ground outside the dome entrance glazed white, the grass stiff, the air carrying a quality she recognized from 40 years of Nebraska mornings, a particular sharpness like a knife that had been left outside overnight. She had been waiting for it. She had also been hoping it would hold off another 2 weeks. It had not held off. She lay still in the darkness and listened to Clem breathe beside her. 8 years old, still too thin from the summer his parents died when grief had taken his appetite for 2 months, and she had spent those months cooking everything she could think of that he had ever liked, trying to coax him back to the business of being alive. He was heavier now than he had been in July. Not enough, but more. She had 31 cents. She had no filing fee. She had a dome that was finished in its walls and roof, but not yet in its ceiling. There were gaps at the base where the wire met the sod foundation. Thin spots at the joints between mud applications, a place near the stovepipe collar where the clay had cracked twice and would crack again unless she found a way to mix it differently. She had 8 weeks perhaps before the killing cold came in earnest. She got up and started working. The dome's construction in the weeks after Conrad Webb's second visit had settled into a rhythm that was less about inspiration than about the patient grinding accumulation of small tasks done correctly in sequence. Nell had built things before. She had helped Reuben build a chicken coop, a smokehouse, a root cellar, with stone walls that had taken them the better part of 2 summers. She understood that construction was mostly not the exciting parts. It was mostly mortar and measurement and the willingness to tear out what was wrong and do it again. The willow pole frame had needed bracing she had not initially planned for. The dome shape distributed weight well, but the points where the poles crossed at the apex had shown a tendency to shift under wind pressure, and she had spent 3 days lashing additional cross pieces until the skeleton stopped moving. The inner wire layer had gone up more slowly than the outer one because she was working from the inside of a confined space with her arms above her head, and at 63 the muscles across her upper back had opinions about this, that they expressed loudly and without restraint. The tumbleweed packing was the part that never got easier. Every plant had to be compressed by hand forced into the wire cavity and held there while she worked a neighboring section to lock it in place. Her hands, wrapped in blanket strips, accumulated new damage faster than the old damage could heal. By the 3rd week of October, she had stopped looking at them. She knew what they looked like. Looking did not help. Clem worked beside her every day. He had taken on the mud work without being asked, mixing the clay with water. From snow she melted in the cookpot, adding dried grass in the proportions she had showed him, applying it to the joints with a flat piece of broken board that served as a trowel. He was methodical about it in the way that children who have experienced real fear become methodical about practical tasks. He understood in the way that 8-year-olds understand things that are too large for them but too present to ignore, that the mud seals were the difference between cold that was survivable and cold that was not. Lars Holmgren came by twice in October. The first time he stood outside the dome for a long time without speaking, then walked around the perimeter with his hands in his coat pockets, pausing at the base where the banking was thickest and pressing his boot against the compressed tumbleweed. "Wind will test those joints," he said. "I know. You need the mud thicker at the base, 6 inches minimum where the wall meets the ground. Heat sinks, and that's where the cold gets in first." She looked at him. He had spent 6 winters here. He knew things she was still learning. "Thank you," she said. He grunted, looked at the stovepipe collar rising from the dome's apex. "Did you insulate around that pipe?" She had. She showed him scrap tin bent into a collar packed with clay and dried grass sealed with multiple layers of mud that had been allowed to dry between applications. He looked at it for a long moment. She watched him decide something the way you can see a decision moving across a person's face if you know how to look. "I have hay I can spare," he said finally. "Not much, a wagon load, maybe 2. Cattle need most of it, but if you can haul it yourself, you can have what's over." Nell felt something ease in her chest that she had not realized was tight. Fuel. Real fuel, not just the twisted grass and scattered chips that were disappearing faster than she could gather them. "I'll haul it tomorrow," she said. "Not tomorrow. Weather's turning. Day after." He rode east without further conversation, and she went back to sealing mud until it was too dark to see. She hauled the hay on the following clear day, making 3 trips with a makeshift sled built from salvaged boards and a length of rope she had found rotting in the dugout corner. Each load weighed more than she should have been pulling. She pulled it anyway. Her hip ground and protested. She stopped when she needed to rest it until the worst of it passed and kept moving. The hay filled the corner of the dome where the broken chair had been, and she packed more against the interior walls as additional insulation. And when she was done, she stood in the small, dark space and let herself feel for a moment something she had not permitted herself since August. Not hope exactly. Hope was too large and too easily broken. What she felt was more like the particular steadiness that comes from having done the thing that needed to be done. It lasted about as long as it deserved to before the next problem arrived. Conrad Webb came back in late October, and this time he came alone. He rode up on a gray afternoon when the sky had the flat, featureless quality that meant snow somewhere behind it, and he sat on his horse outside the finished dome for a moment before dismounting. He did not walk around it this time. He just looked at it, the mud-sealed walls, the tumbleweed packed tight between the wire layers, the stovepipe rising from the apex with its clay collar, the banked additional tumbleweed around the base that brought the insulation thickness to nearly 3 feet at ground level. His face was unreadable in the way that carefully maintained faces are unreadable. "You finished it," he said. "Yes." He looked at the land office papers in his hand. She had not noticed them until now. He held them loosely the way a man holds something he wants you to see without appearing to show you. $14, he said. "The filing fee. You still don't have it. I checked." She did not answer. "I could file on this claim tomorrow," he said. "Legally, cleanly, walk into the Imperial Land Office and put $14 on the counter and walk out owning this quarter section." He paused. "I want you to understand that I could do that. I want you to understand that I'm choosing not to." Why, she said. She was genuinely asking. "Because I'd rather you left on your own." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. "I'd rather you took the boy and walked away and found somewhere you could actually survive. What you've built here," he nodded at the dome without looking at it directly, "might hold for a few weeks. It won't hold for a Nebraska January. When it fails, I'll have to explain to people why I let an old woman and a child freeze to death on property I was planning to claim anyway. That's an inconvenience I'd prefer to avoid." "Then I'll try not to freeze," Nell said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Frustration, she thought, but with an edge of something else underneath. Something that looked almost like reluctant acknowledgement. He remounted without another word and rode north toward Imperial. Nell watched him go. Then she turned back to the dome and went inside, sat down on the packed earth floor, and counted what she actually had for the 4th time since August. The number was still wrong. The filing fee was still $14. She still had 31 cents. She sat in the stillness of the dome's interior, the tumbleweed walls pressing in around her, the stovepipe rising dark and cold from the center of the space, and let the weight of it settle. 63 years old, 1 grandson, no money, no claim, a structure that everyone except Clem thought would fail, and Clem was 8 years old and trusted her because he did not have the option of not trusting her, which was its own kind of weight. She was sitting there when she heard the mule outside. Dorothea Paxton ducked through the entrance without announcing herself. She stood in the dome's interior for a moment, adjusting to the dim light, and looked around with the same careful thoroughness she brought to everything. She pressed her palm against the tumbleweed wall, left it there for a moment, pressed harder. "It's warmer than outside," she said, significantly. Dot turned in a slow circle, taking in the mud seals, the banked interior walls, the stovepipe collar. She was the kind of woman who inspected things before forming opinions, which Nell had come to understand was rarer than it should have been. "Conrad was here," Nell said. It was not a question. "He was, yesterday." Dot reached into her coat. "He told me you were going to die on this claim, and I was going to lose my scraps of chicken wire." She pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I told him he had a very poor understanding of what I was and was not willing to lose." She held out the paper. Nell took it, unfolded it. The light inside the dome was dim, but she could read the official stamp, the ink of the land office, her own name written in the clerk's careful hand above the legal description of the quarter section. A homestead claim, stamped, registered, filed. Her hands began to shake. "The fee," she said, $14. Dot's voice was even. "I went to Imperial the day after Conrad came to see me. Told the clerk I was filing as guarantor for a head of household who qualified under the homestead provisions. He made me sign the paperwork myself." She paused. "You can pay me back when you prove up, if you're still alive to do it." Nell looked at the paper. The shaking in her hands was getting worse. She had not cried since Reuben's funeral, not in front of anyone, not where Clem could see, and she did not cry now, but the effort of not crying was a physical thing, a tightening across the chest that she had to breathe around carefully. "Conrad came to you," she said. "He told me I was throwing good money after bad. Told me you'd be dead by Christmas, and I'd never see a cent of it back." Dot looked at her steadily. "Chong Toy." She stopped, switched back. "My husband trusted the wrong man. Trusted a handshake where there should have been paper. I know how that ends." She glanced at the claim document. "I wanted there to be paper this time." Nell folded the claim carefully and put it inside her coat next to her chest where the warmth of her body would keep it dry. She was a homesteader. She had a claim that was legally, officially, inarguably hers. "You're not out of danger," Dot said. "Not unkindly, as a fact. You have almost no fuel stores. Your food situation is serious. Conrad still has time to make trouble if he's inclined. And the real cold hasn't come yet." "I know. The real test is still coming." Dot moved toward the entrance, stopped and looked back. "But what you've done here, what you've built, I wouldn't have believed it was possible." She shook her head slowly. "I'll check on you in 2 weeks. If you're dead, I'll see that the boy is looked after." She ducked through the entrance. Nell heard the mule's hooves moving away to the southwest. She sat alone in the dome for a long time. The paper was warm inside her coat. The walls pressed close and dark and still around her, and outside the wind had picked up, carrying the smell that Nebraska wind carries in late October, the smell of distance, of emptiness, of weather that is building itself somewhere north of the Dakotas and moving south with no particular hurry and no concern whatsoever for what it finds when it arrives. She had a claim. She still had to survive long enough to keep it. November passed in a blur of cold and calculation. The dome held. That was the thing she had not fully allowed herself to believe, and now had to believe because the evidence was undeniable. The temperature outside dropped to 8 degrees on the morning of November's third week, then to 4, then to 12 below zero on the 22nd, when Lars Holmgren's thermometer, the one he had brought from Norway, and maintained with the care of a man who understood that accurate measurement was the difference between managing a situation and being managed by it, read numbers that would have been frightening to see written down. Inside the dome, with the entrance sealed and 2 bodies breathing in the darkness, the temperature never fell below 31 degrees. It was not warm. Nell wanted to be precise about that even in her own mind. 31 degrees was not warm. It was 1 degree above the point where water froze. She and Clem slept in all their clothes pressed together under the wool blanket in the makeshift quilt she had sewn from grain sacks stuffed with prairie grass, their breath visible in the dim light of the bank stove. The water bucket developed a skin of ice overnight that she broke each morning with the handle of the cook spoon. But they did not freeze. They did not come close to freezing. And every morning when she broke the ice and looked at the temperature and then looked at the walls of the dome, those compressed, thorny, unglamorous walls of worthless weed, she felt the same thing. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. The particular satisfaction of a thing that was right being right. She burned the stove twice a day. 1 hour in the morning to cook breakfast and raise the interior temperature to something closer to 50 degrees. 1 hour in the evening to cook supper and heat water. The fuel was lasting longer than she had calculated in August when she had run the numbers in her head with the pessimism that honest arithmetic required. The dome's insulation was doing more work than she had dared to project. By the end of November, she still had 28 bushels of hay and chips remaining. Enough if she was careful for another 6 weeks. The food was harder. She had foraged everything she could find before the snow covered the prairie, dried rose hips, wild turnips, the seeds from sunflower heads she found along the dry creek bed. She had traded 2 days' labor at the Holmgren farm for 10 pounds of cornmeal and 5 pounds of dried beans. A cup of cornmeal mush in the morning, a thin soup of beans, and whatever roots she could dig from under the snow at the edge of the draw in the evening. It was not enough for a winter. She knew it was not enough. She rationed it and told herself she would figure something out when she reached the point where there was nothing left to figure with, and she put that point as far away in the future as careful management allowed, and she did not think about it more than she had to. Lars Holmgren came in early December to check on them. He stood inside the dome for a long time without speaking. The temperature outside was 6 degrees. Inside, with the entrance sealed and the stove not yet lit for the day, it was 34. She watched him press his palm flat against the tumbleweed wall, the same gesture Dot had made 2 months earlier, and hold it there. "It's working," he said. Yes. He did not say he had been wrong. He was not the kind of man who said that, but his expression had shifted from the careful dismissal of his first visit to something she could not quite name, a kind of attention that was different in quality from what had been there before. "January and February are harder than November," he said. "Cold goes deeper. Storms last longer. Fuel runs out faster because you can't go out to gather more." He paused. "But this what you've built here might hold." Might. She had come to understand that might from Lars Holmgren was as close to a compliment as the geography of his character permitted. He left more hay. A wagon load he said the cattle could do without. She did not argue. She thanked him and began hauling it inside, adding to the corner store banking, more against the interior walls, packing it into every space that could hold it. That night she fell asleep before supper. Clem ate his cornmeal mush and covered her with the extra grain sack and did not wake her. December the 23rd brought the first real blizzard. She saw it building that morning, a dark line on the northwestern horizon, the kind of line that had no business being that solid unless something very large was behind it. She had grown up on the plains. She knew the difference between weather that was coming and weather that was arriving, and this was arriving. Fast and certain, the way bad things arrive when they have been gathering themselves for a long time. By noon, the wind had risen to a sustained howl. By 2 in the afternoon, she could not see the broken windmill 20 feet from the dome entrance. She sealed everything. The entrance blanket was weighted down with stones and backed with a packed layer of tumbleweed. She wrestled into position against the inside frame. The stovepipe gap was stuffed tight with grass. Every thin spot in the mud she had identified over the past weeks was packed again with the last of the clay. She banked additional tumbleweed around the entire exterior, piling it as high as she could work, until the dome had an outer layer of loose insulation 3 feet thick at the base. The storm settled in with the deliberate permanence of something that intended to stay. Inside the dome, the wind was a different experience than outside. She had prepared for noise. She had lived in a dugout and knew what wind sounded like when it pressed against earth and sod. What she had not fully prepared for was the specific sound the tumbleweed walls made under sustained pressure. A low, dense creaking, the chicken wire flexing against the willow poles, the compressed plant material shifting almost imperceptibly as the wind pushed against the outer surface. Not alarming exactly, but present. A constant reminder that the storm was there and the walls were the only thing between it and them. The temperature inside dropped to 28 degrees on the first night. She lit the stove and pushed it back to 36, held it there through the evening. Let the fire die when the fuel cost became too high to sustain, and watched the temperature fall back to 32 as the dome's insulation stabilized it. On the second night, Clem started coughing. It was a small cough at first, the kind that starts with dry air and cold rooms and often stops there. She gave him warm water she had melted from snow, packed against the stove's side, and a spoonful of honey she had kept in a cloth-stop jar since September, and told him to sleep. By morning, the cough had settled deeper into his chest. By evening, his forehead was hot against her palm. Fever. On the Nebraska plains in winter, fever killed. Not always. Not even usually if you could keep the patient warm and hydrated and still. But the conditions that permitted fever to be merely dangerous rather than fatal required things she was running short of fuel to keep the temperature up, water that was not ice food that would sustain a sick child's body through the work of fighting an infection. She kept the stove burning through the second night. Burning hard, burning recklessly by the standard of her rationing, because rationing was a calculation made for normal circumstances, and these were not normal circumstances anymore. The hay level in the corner dropped by a third. She boiled snow water and made Clem breathe the steam. She pulled him against her body and held him through the long hours when he was too feverish to sleep properly and too weak to do anything but shiver. She talked to him. She talked because his breathing scared her, and the sound of her own voice was the only thing she had to put between herself and the fear. She told him about the winter she and Reuben had spent in their first dugout, the one that smelled of wood smoke and earth when they had been young and had not yet learned how many things they did not know. She told him about his grandfather's hands, how they had looked building the root cellar, how they had looked holding Clem as a newborn, with the particular carefulness of a large man handling something he is afraid of breaking. She told him about his mother at Clem's age before the move west, when she had been a small girl in a house that was warm all winter because there was wood enough and money enough, and the things that killed people here had not yet entered the vocabulary of their lives. She did not know if Clem could hear her through the fever. She talked anyway. On the third day the blizzard eased, not ended eased. The wind dropped from a sustained howl to an intermittent one. Nell dug out through the snow that had drifted against the entrance, 4 feet of it packed dense and heavy, and stood in the pale gray light of a Nebraska December morning and looked at a world that had been simplified down to its essential elements. White ground, white sky, the broken windmill buried to its hub, the fence post gone entirely, the sound of nothing, which on the plains is not the same as silence, but is the absence of wind and is almost more disorienting. Thomas's fever had not broken. She could not take him to a doctor. Imperial was 12 miles north, Culberson 60 miles east, and the snow between here and either of them was 4 feet deep in the drifts and knee-high on the open ground, and still falling lightly from a sky that had not decided whether it was finished. Carrying a sick 8-year-old through that distance would kill them both before they reached the road. She could not leave him to go for help. He was 8 years old and feverish, and if the stove went cold while she was gone, the dome's temperature would drop to the level where the fever became irrelevant. She could not do anything except what she was already doing. She went back inside and sealed the entrance and fed the stove and held Clem against her and kept talking. The fuel level dropped below 10 bushels, below 8, below 5. She started burning the bedding straw, pulling it out of the grain sack quilt one handful at a time. Then the dried grass she had stuffed into the gaps around the entrance frame. Then the wood from the frame of the broken chair she had kept because she could not think of anything else to do with it. The morning of December 28th, she touched Clem's forehead in the darkness before dawn and felt something different, cool, damp with clean sweat instead of the dry, papery heat of infection. The fever's quality had changed from the inside out, from the fever that consumes to the fever that retreats. She pressed her palm flat against his cheek and held it there for a long moment, making sure. He opened his eyes. In the dim glow of the nearly dead stove, she could see him focus on her face. "Grandma," he said. His voice was rough from the cough. "I'm hungry." She made him cornmeal mush with the last of the honey and watched him eat half of it and fall back into sleep. Real sleep this time, deep and rhythmic, his breathing clear. She sat beside the cooling stove and did the arithmetic of what remained. 4 bushels of hay and chips, 2 pounds of cornmeal, a handful of dried beans. January had not arrived yet. Clem was alive. The dome had held through a 3-day blizzard, and she was still here, still upright, still unwilling to concede the point to the winter, or to Conrad Webb, or to anyone else who had looked at her situation and written the conclusion before the story was finished. But the real cold was still coming. Lars had told her that in December, and she had believed him, and she had been right to believe him, because what the blizzard had been was the prelude. January in Nebraska was the thing itself. She looked at the walls of the dome in the dim dying light of the stove. The tumbleweed compressed tight in its wire cage, barely visible in the darkness, doing its work in the dark and the cold. And the silence, the way useful things do their work, without drama, without acknowledgement, simply by being what they were and being in the right place. She had built this with 31 cents and 2 months of work she was not sure her body had left in it. She had sealed it with mud she mixed by hand and dried grass she cut herself and clay she dug from beside a well that would never hold water again. She had compressed the worthless thing by hand until her hands were past feeling and packed it tight enough to trap the air and held the whole structure together with wire and bent nails and rawhide that had shrunk dry in the September heat. And it was 34 degrees inside while 12 below waited outside. She was going to need more fuel. She was going to need it soon. She did not have it and did not know yet where it would come from. She closed her eyes and sat in the darkness and let herself be tired for exactly as long as she could afford. Then she opened her eyes and began thinking about what to do next. Outside, the wind picked up again. The tumbleweed walls absorbed it the same way they absorbed everything, by holding still against the pressure, by refusing to let the air through. January was 10 days away. The real test was still coming, and she was still here, and those two facts were the only ones that mattered. January on the Nebraska plain was not a season. It was an argument. It was the land making its final unambiguous case for why human beings had no business being here. Why the grass and the wind and the flat, merciless sky had been perfectly sufficient before anyone arrived with their sod bricks and their windmills and their stubborn conviction that a person could plant a life in a soil that froze 6 inches deep and call it home. January was Nebraska's honest self. Everything before it was negotiation. January was the answer. Nell had known 6 Nebraska Januaries. She had survived all of them from inside a proper house with a husband beside her and fuel enough and food enough and walls that had been built by men who understood the climate they were building against. She had known they were hard. She had not known, in the way that knowledge becomes physical and permanent, exactly how hard. She was learning now. The temperature dropped to 26 below zero on the 3rd of January. She knew this because Lars Holmgren told her afterward. His thermometer had frozen at 20 below and refused to register anything colder, which was its own kind of information. She felt the difference in the dome, not as a number, but as a quality. The air inside had changed. It had weight to it, a density, as if the cold had stopped being merely cold and had become something with intention. The tumbleweed walls contracted slightly. She could see it in the dim light, the compressed plant material drawing inward a fraction, the frozen stems shrinking in temperatures they had never been constructed to withstand. Ice formed on the interior surface of the outer wall where her breath condensed against it and froze in thin crystalline sheets that she scraped off each morning with the flat of her hand. The mud seals cracked overnight, and she repacked them by touch in the dark, working by feel alone because there was not always light enough to see by, and the work needed to be done regardless. The interior temperature held at 24 degrees, not warm. She had stopped thinking in terms of warm. 24 degrees meant she could see her breath. It meant the water bucket froze solid overnight and had to be thawed against the stove before she and Clem could drink. It meant sleeping in every garment she owned, layered in the specific order she had worked out by trial. Over the past months, the thinnest things closest to the skin to trap body heat, the heaviest on the outside to slow its escape with Clem pressed against her side, and both of them under every piece of cloth she had been able to manufacture or salvage since August. But 24 degrees did not kill. She burned fuel carefully now. Not the aggressive rationing of November, when she had been managing toward an unknown future, but a precise and calibrated burn, exactly enough wood and hay to raise the temperature to a level that Clem's recovery required, held for exactly the time necessary, then allowed to drop back to what the dome's insulation could maintain on its own. She had learned the dome's thermal behavior over 4 months, the way you learn a horse's temperament, its quirks and rhythms, the specific ways it responded to different conditions, the points where pushing harder helped, and the points where it made things worse. Her fuel store shrank, 12 bushels to 8, 8 to 5, 5 to 3. She started burning the bedding straw she had restuffed after the December blizzard, then the extra grain sacks. Then, with the particular grief of destroying something useful, the willow pole sections she had cut for the frame's secondary bracing, the ones she had added in October as reinforcement, and now dismantled, carefully burning them one at a time, watching each one glow and collapse in the stove. On January the 7th, she burned the last of the twisted hay. She sat on the packed earth floor of the dome and looked at the empty corner where the fuel had been. Clem sat beside her. He had recovered from the fever with the resilience that children bring to surviving things that would take longer to kill an adult. But the recovery had cost him weight he did not have to spare, and he was thin again in the way that worried her. She looked at the walls, the tumbleweed. Thousands of compressed plants, dense and thorny, and locked in their wire cages, pressing against each other in the specific way she had calculated and designed and forced into place with her bleeding hands over the course of a September and October that felt from here like they had happened to a different woman in a different life. She could burn them. She knew it would work. The compression that made them resist flame in normal circumstances could be undone by pulling sections loose and feeding them into the stove one piece at a time. They would burn hot and fast, but they would burn. If she dismantled the dome from the inside out, section by section, she could generate heat for perhaps 2 days, maybe 3. And then there would be no dome, no walls, no insulation, nothing between them and January, which would complete its argument in a matter of hours. She could not burn the walls. If she burned the walls, they would die before the fire went out. She sealed the stove. She did not light it again. For 3 days, they survived on body heat alone. She and Clem lay together under everything she owned, moving as little as possible because movement accelerated heat loss from the skin's surface. Breathing slowly and steadily, because she had read once that controlled breathing in extreme cold slowed the body's demand on its own reserves. She melted snow for water by packing the cookpot with handfuls of it and holding the pot against her abdomen, using her body's warmth to do what the stove no longer could. It took 20 minutes to produce a cup of cold water from a pot of snow. She did it methodically, refilling and remelting throughout the day, keeping Clem drinking because hydration mattered, and because giving him a task that required his participation kept his mind engaged and his body producing its small but non-negligible heat. The interior temperature dropped to 18 degrees. Frost formed on the blanket's outer surface. Their water froze between drinking and the next melt if she set it down too long. The mud seals cracked in multiple places overnight, and she no longer had the clay or the energy to repack all of them, so she pressed dried grass into the largest gaps with her fingers and moved on. 18 degrees. Cold enough to be dangerous. Not cold enough to kill quickly if you were clothed and together and still. She had calculated this in her head during the long, dark hours when Clem slept, and she lay awake doing the only thing she could do, which was to think clearly about what was true and what was not, and where the line between survivable and unsurvivable actually ran. The dome's insulation was holding 18 degrees inside while January pressed 26 below against the outside. A difference of 44 degrees. 44 degrees of protection generated by compressed dead weeds and still air, and the accumulated wisdom of 63 years distilled into a structure that everyone who had seen it had assumed would fail. On the evening of January the 10th, she heard something outside the entrance. She was not asleep. She had not been fully asleep in 3 days. She dozed in the way that the body insists on, regardless of circumstances. The 15-minute collapses of consciousness that were not rest but were better than nothing. And she came out of one of these to hear a sound she could not immediately place. A scraping, a rhythmic compression of snow. Then barely audible through the tumbleweed walls and the banked entrance, a voice. She was across the dome and pulling the entrance blanket aside before she had fully decided to move. Dorothea Paxton fell inward with the door collapsing against the interior wall, and Nell caught her by the coat and pulled her the rest of the way inside and sealed the entrance behind her in one continuous motion that she accomplished entirely on instinct. Dot's hands were wrapped in rags that had frozen stiff as wood. Her face was the color of old wax frostbite, already marking her cheeks and the tip of her nose in the white patches that meant the tissue beneath had given up its heat. She was pulling a rope. The rope was attached to a sled. The sled, which had been pushed in ahead of her before the entrance sealed, held a load of hay. Good hay, dense and dry, the kind that farms saved for their best animals. She was 54 years old, and she had come 3 miles through a January night on the Nebraska plain with a sled full of fuel for a woman she was not related to and had known for 5 months. Nell got her to the floor beside the coal stove. She pulled the frozen rags from Dot's hands. The fingers were white and stiff, and Dot hissed when Nell pressed warmth against them, which was the sound of tissue that still had feeling in it, which was the sound of hands that could still be saved. "I came to see if you were dead," Dot said. Her voice was thick and slow, the way voices get when the body has been spending everything it has on staying warm and has very little left for speech. "I'm not dead," Nell said. "I can see that." She looked at Clem, who was watching from the blankets with wide eyes. "The boy recovered. He's all right." Dot closed her eyes briefly. "Good." A pause. "I looked in on the Holmgrens first. Sigrid said Lars went out to check the cattle this morning and hadn't come back. She was going to wait till morning to worry." Another pause longer. I told her to worry now. Nell did not respond to this. She began loading the stove from the sled's hay, working fast because the interior temperature had dropped another degree while the entrance was open and the stove needed to be producing heat as quickly as possible. The fire caught on the second attempt. She fed it steadily and watched the orange light move across the dome's interior walls. Dot's hands began to hurt. This was the right direction for frostbitten hands to move from white and numb toward red and agonizing, and Nell held them and let her work through the pain without comment because there was nothing useful to say about it. 3 of the fingers on the left hand remained white longer than the others. She did not say what she thought about those 3 fingers. Some information needed to arrive in its own time. Clem got up and brought Dot a cup of the water Nell had been melting all day. He carried it in both hands with the deliberate carefulness of a child who understands that spilling it is not an option. Dot drank it without speaking and looked at him over the rim of the cup with an expression that was not quite able to form itself into anything definable. You walk 3 miles in this, Nell said. It was not a question. Yes. With a sled. The hay wasn't going to carry itself. Nell looked at her. 54 years old, frozen hands, 3 miles in a January night on the open plain. The hay stacked on the sled behind her, enough fuel for 2 weeks if she was careful, 3 if she burned it the way she had learned to burn things in this dome. Why, Nell asked. The same question she had asked in September. The real question, not the rhetorical one. Dot turned her damaged hands slowly in the warmth rising from the stove. Because I paid $14 to make sure you had a claim worth surviving for, she said. I wasn't going to let January make that a bad investment. The temperature inside the dome climbed back through the 20s and into the mid-30s. Clem fell back into sleep. Dot stayed through the night, half conscious, against the interior wall, and Nell kept the stove fed and watched the frost on the blankets soften and melt, and told herself that the crisis had passed, knowing that it had passed for now, knowing that now was the only unit of time that mattered. In the morning, Dot left 2 more sled loads of hay she had cached outside the entrance before coming in. She had made 2 trips in the dark before knocking, she said, because she had not been sure anyone was alive to open the door, and she had wanted the supplies accessible regardless. She left instruction, come to her farm if it got worse. Not as a suggestion, as a requirement. I mean it, she said at the entrance, her rewrapped hands pulling the sled rope. If you run out again, you come to me. Don't sit here deciding to die alone because you don't want to be a burden. That's not strength. That's pride dressed up as strength. And out here, pride costs more than you can afford. Nell nodded. She meant the nod. She meant it in the specific and unconditional way she had learned to mean things in the past 5 months, not the way she used to mean things, which was with the quiet reservation of a person who had not yet fully understood what she was willing to do to survive. She watched Dot move southwest through the snow until she was a small, dark shape against the white, and then nothing at all. January the 12th arrived on a stillness. Nell woke at first light to a quiet so complete it registered as wrong before she was fully conscious. The wind that had been blowing with varying intensity for 6 straight weeks had stopped. She lay still and listened to the absence of it, feeling the silence the way you feel a sound that has suddenly stopped, as something removed rather than something never there. She got up and went to the entrance, pulled the blanket aside. The temperature outside was 34 degrees above zero, January. 34 degrees. She stood in the entrance of the dome and felt warm air on her face in the middle of the worst month of the Nebraska winter, and understood immediately with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had spent her adult life reading weather that this was not kindness. The sky to the northwest was clear, not the flat, milky clear of winter calm, a deeper clear, an emptied clear, the kind that comes when something very large has moved everything that was in its way out of its way. She started sealing the dome at noon. She packed every gap she could find, pressed additional tumbleweed against the exterior base until the banking was 4 feet thick, stuffed the entrance frame with dried grass until the blanket sat tight against it with no give, checked the stovepipe collar, pressed more clay into the crack that had been widening since December, repacked the mud seals at every joint. She worked with the focused urgency of a person who could see the thing coming but could not yet feel it, and who understood that the interval between seeing and feeling was the only time she had. Clem came outside at 1 in the afternoon without his coat. She called him back inside without explanation. He came reading her face and did not ask questions. By 2, the sky to the northwest had changed character. The clear was gone. In its place was something she had no adequate word for, a darkness that was not cloud, that was too uniform and too fast-moving to be cloud, that was advancing across the plain at a speed she had only seen once before in a summer storm that had taken the roof off a barn and deposited it in a field a quarter-mile east. She had the entrance sealed at 2:15. The storm hit at 2:30. She had told herself after the December blizzard that she understood what a Nebraska blizzard was. She had been wrong. The December storm had been an introduction. This was the subject itself. The wind did not rise. It arrived. One moment the air was still, the next it was moving at a speed that pressed the entire dome inward simultaneously, a force distributed across every surface of the structure at once so that the walls did not flex in one place, but flexed everywhere, the tumbleweed shifting in its wire cages, the willow poles bending slightly at every joint, the whole structure conducting the force of the storm through itself and finding, because she had built it to find this, that the dome shape distributed the load, that no single point bore more than its share, that the structure as a whole was more resistant to the force than any of its individual components would have been. The sound was unlike anything she had heard in 63 years. Not a howl, not a roar. Something past both of those, a sustained, omnidirectional assault on every surface the way she imagined. Standing at the bottom of a waterfall would sound if the water were frozen and moving at 60 miles an hour. It filled the inside of the dome, absorbed and muffled by the tumbleweed walls, but present, undeniable, constant. Thomas pressed against her side with his face buried in her coat. She could feel him shaking. She kept her arm around him and said nothing, because anything she said would be absorbed by the storm's noise before it reached him, and because the walls would either hold or they would not, and there was nothing her voice could add to the physics of the situation. "It's holding," she said anyway, directly against his ear where he could hear it. "The walls are holding." The temperature inside dropped from 40 degrees to 35 in the first hour, from 35 to 28 in the second, from 28 to 22 by nightfall. She burned hay as fast as she could justify, faster than the careful rationing of the past weeks, because there was no point in careful rationing if the temperature dropped below the line where it became irrelevant. The fire pushed back against the cold, held the interior at 28. The hay level dropped. At midnight, she heard something at the entrance that was not the storm. The storm had a consistent voice. By then, she had been listening to it for 10 hours, and she knew its register, its rhythm, the specific quality of the sound it made against the dome's exterior. What she heard at midnight was different. A counterpoint, a scratching that was not wind, a voice barely audible, barely human, swallowed by the storm before it fully formed. She was at the entrance and pulling the blanket before she had thought about it. Sigrid Holmgren came through the opening and fell against Nell's shoulder, and the two of them went down together against the interior wall, and Nell got the entrance sealed with one hand, while holding Sigrid with the other, and the storm's voice filled the dome. For the 3 seconds the entrance was open, with a sound that made Clem press himself flat against the far wall with his hands over his ears. Sigrid's coat was torn at the shoulder. Her face was the color of old chalk. Both hands were stiff inside their frozen wrappings, the fingers locked straight, her feet the same. She had been outside in the worst storm Nell had experienced in 6 decades on the plains, for long enough that frostbite had moved from surface to deep tissue in her extremities. She had walked 3 miles. "Lars," she said, her voice was almost nothing. "He went out to the cattle at 9. 3 hours ago. He hasn't come back." She stopped. Her breath was ragged, shallow, the breath of a body that has spent everything and is running on obligation alone. "I know he's gone. I know no one comes back from 3 hours in this. But I couldn't—" She stopped again. "You couldn't stay in the house alone," Nell said. Sigrid looked at her. In her eyes was a grief so recent it had not yet fully arrived, the knowledge of a thing that the emotions had not caught up to yet, because the body had been too busy surviving to permit grief its moment. "No," she said, "I couldn't." Nell got her to the floor beside the stove. She worked Sigrid's frozen wrappings off with the same methodical care she had used on Dot's hands 2 days earlier, gently, steadily watching for the color change that meant circulation returning, listening for the hiss of pain that meant the tissue beneath could still feel. Both hands came back to painful life. most of the fingers. 3 on her left hand remained white longer than the others. The same 3 had lost feeling in, and Nell began to understand that these were the fingers January always took first. Clem brought water without being asked. He moved through the dome with a steadiness that she registered and stored away, the particular steadiness of a child who has learned that crisis requires function, who has absorbed this lesson through the specific curriculum of the past 5 months. She kept the stove fed through the night. The hay level dropped below 2 bushels. She looked at it and looked at the walls and made the decision she had made twice before, the decision that was not recklessness, but its opposite, the decision that emerged from understanding rather than from hope. When the hay was gone, she sealed the stove and drew Clem and Sigrid against her on either side, and the 3 of them lay in the darkness of the dome while January did what it had come to do. 22 degrees inside, -26 outside. The walls held. The storm continued for 2 more days. On the morning of the 3rd day, Nell woke to something she recognized before she opened her eyes. A change in the dome's acoustic quality. The storm's voice had been absorbed into the walls for so long that its absence when it finally arrived registered as a physical change in the air pressure rather than simply a reduction in noise. She got up and went to the entrance and pushed through and stood in the pale, flat light of a January morning after the worst blizzard in a decade. The world had been reorganized. The broken windmill was gone, buried entirely, leaving a low, smooth mound where it had been. The fence posts had disappeared. The eastern fence line itself was visible only as a slight irregularity in the surface of the snow, a long, gentle ridge where the tumbleweed behind it had caught and held the drifting. The dome rose behind her like a hill that had always been there, battered along its eastern face where the wind had pressed hardest, but whole, unbroken. The mud seals on the windward side had cracked and would need repacking. One section of exterior banking had been pushed loose and lay scattered. Everything else stood. The temperature outside was 4 below zero. She stood in it and felt it on her face, sharp, clean, the honest cold of after storm, and looked in every direction across a landscape that was the same, white in every direction, and offered nothing. She did not look for Lars Holmgren. She knew in the way that 63 years of understanding winter and what it does had made her know things she would have preferred not to know, that looking was not going to accomplish anything, that waiting could not also accomplish. She went back inside. Sigrid was awake, sitting against the wall with Clem leaning against her shoulder, the 2 of them in the particular quiet of people who have been through something together and do not need to speak about it. They found Lars 2 days later when the search party from Imperial finally reached the Holmgren farm. He had made it to within 200 feet of the barn. The cattle had survived. They had crowded into the northeastern corner of the barn, pressed against each other, sharing the heat of 30 bodies in an enclosed space, doing by instinct the thing that Nell had designed the dome to accomplish by calculation. They were thin, and they were frightened, and they were alive. Lars Holmgren, who had survived 6 Nebraska winters, died in the 7th trying to reach them. He was 65 years old. He had done everything right by the standards of a lifetime spent on the plains. Proper house, proper fuel stores, proper preparation, and the storm had simply exceeded the margin that proper preparation had built. He had told her in December that the dome might hold. The dome had held. His wife had survived inside it, pressed against the woman he had warned away from this claim in August, while the cattle whose lives he died trying to protect survived by doing the same thing Nell had been doing all winter. The storm that killed Lars Holmgren killed 11 other people in Chase County that January. Across the Nebraska Plain, Kansas, the Dakota Territory, and Minnesota, the death toll climbed through the hundreds. The newspapers called it the blizzard of 1887. The people who had lived through it called it the worst storm in memory. The people who had not lived through it were not asked for their opinion. Inside a dome built from tumbleweed and chicken wire and bent nails and repacked mud, and the physical intelligence of a 63-year-old woman who had nothing else to work with, 3 people had waited it out. Dorothea Paxton arrived on the 3rd day after the storm with a sled full of supplies and tears on her face, frozen halfway down her cheeks in the cold. She looked at the dome, battered, banked with wind-piled snow on the eastern face, the exterior tumbleweed rearranged by 48 hours of sustained assault, but the underlying structure intact, and she stood there looking at it for a long time without speaking. "You're alive," she said finally. "We're alive," Nell said. Dot looked at Sigrid, who had come to stand in the dome's entrance, wrapped in every blanket Nell owned. Something passed between the two women, an acknowledgement, a grief, an understanding of what had been lost and what had not been lost, in the specific way those two things existed together in the same moment. The Henderson family lost their youngest, Dot said. She was not reading from a list. She was saying names because names were what was left when people were gone. Baby froze in the sod house, roof collapsed under the snow weight, and they couldn't hold the heat. The Metzger widow lost 3 fingers to frostbite. The Arnott family's cattle are all dead. She paused. 11 people that I know of. More once the search parties finish. She looked at the dome, shook her head in a slow, wondering motion. And you in this thing built from weeds and wire. Nell did not say anything. She was too tired for vindication, which required energy she no longer had. She was alive. Clem was alive. Sigrid Holmgren, who would carry the grief of January the 12th with her for the rest of her life, was alive in the dome behind her. Those facts were sufficient. They were everything. March came the way spring always comes to the Nebraska plain. Not triumphantly, not all at once, but in concessions. A day above freezing. A patch of bare ground on a south-facing slope. The sound of water moving somewhere under the snow. The grass, beaten flat and pale by winter, beginning to show something at its roots that was not quite green yet, but was moving in that direction. Word had spread faster than the thaw. By February, 3 families had come to see the dome. By the beginning of March, the number had reached a dozen. They rode up on horses and mules, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, and they walked through the entrance and stood in the dim interior and pressed their palms against the compressed tumbleweed walls, the way everyone who had ever entered the dome pressed their palms against the walls. It was an instinctive gesture, the need to feel with your own hand whether the warmth was real. It was real. Every one of them said so. Every one of them stood in the same place and said the same thing. It shouldn't be warm in here. But it is. Nell showed them how she had built it. The willow pole frame, the spacing of the poles, the way the arches were braced against each other to distribute load, the double layer of wire and how to attach it. The tumbleweed compression, tighter than you think you need, she always said, and then tighter again. The mud seals the mixture of clay and dried grass, the multiple applications with drying time between each one. The excavated floor, the drainage slope, the stovepipe collar. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick for the people who needed to see it as a picture rather than hear it as words. She did not charge for any of this. She was too busy surviving, and the information itself was the thing that mattered. The idea that the most worthless material on the plains was not worthless. That dead air trapped between thorny branches was worth more than cordwood. In a storm, that the right understanding of a simple physical principle could do what money and proper construction and 6 winters of experience could not always guarantee. Some of them tried it. A homesteader named Erickson built a tumbleweed addition onto his existing sod house, a dome 10 feet wide attached to the south wall, and wrote to his brother in Minnesota that winter to say his fuel consumption had dropped by nearly half. A widow named Gertrude Haas, who had been considering abandoning her claim and moving back to Ohio, built a small dome just large enough for herself and 2 children, and reported surviving the following winter on a fraction of the fuel her neighbors used. Conrad Webb rode past the dome in late February on his way north from Culbertson. He saw the people gathered outside it. He did not stop. He did not look in Nell's direction. He rode past at the same steady pace he had approached in August, and he kept riding, and she did not watch him go. His claim on the quarter section had been rejected by the land office. Dorothea Paxton had filed first, and the filing was clean, and there was nothing legally wrong with it, and the clerk at Imperial had no grounds to reverse it. Conrad sold his own land in March and moved to Colorado. She heard about it secondhand from Dot, who had heard it from the Imperial store owner, who had heard it from a freighter passing through. She did not hear his name after that. She did not look for it. Nell proved up her homestead claim in the spring of 1889. 66 years old, 2 years ahead of the standard 5-year requirement. The land office clerk wrote in his assessment notes that her improvements were unconventional but substantial, a phrase that circulated around Chase County for years afterward, repeated whenever someone tried something that looked impossible and made it work anyway. Clem grew up on the homestead. He was a quiet boy who became a methodical man, comfortable with tools and careful with his hands, with the particular patience of someone who had learned early that patience was not passivity, but its opposite, the willingness to keep working when the working was slow. He married in 1901 and brought his wife to the quarter section, and they built a frame house with lumber hauled from the Imperial Rail Depot, real lumber milled and straight. Nothing like the bent willow poles of the dome, and they put it on the same earth that Conrad Webb had given Nell as a death sentence. The dome stood behind the new house. Nell used it for storage and for visiting neighbors who wanted to see it, and occasionally on bad nights, when the temperature dropped, and she wanted to remember what it felt like to be inside a thing she had built with her own hands when she had nothing else. She would go in and press her palm against the walls, the same gesture, the same instinct, and feel the still air inside them. It shouldn't be warm, but it was. She lived on that quarter section until 1917. 94 years old, she had outlasted Conrad Webb, who died alone in a Colorado mining town in 1901. She had outlasted the dome itself, which finally collapsed in the winter of 1912, when the willow poles gave out 30 years after she had cut them from a creek bed 8 miles south and bent them into arches with her bare hands. She had outlasted everything that had been designed by circumstance or by men or by January to outlast her. Clem was with her at the end. He sat beside her bed in the frame house that stood where the dome had stood, and he held her hand, and she looked out the window at the eastern field where the tumbleweeds still piled against the fence line, every autumn, still worthless, still indestructible, still the most persistent and unglamorous thing on the Nebraska plain, and she thought about still air. The minister who spoke at her funeral said what ministers say, the words shaped by the occasion into something larger than the specific facts they describe. But he mentioned the dome. He mentioned the blizzard. He mentioned the night Sigrid Holmgren had walked 3 miles through the worst storm in a decade and found shelter in a structure that every experienced voice in the county had declared would fail. She built something from nothing, he said, and when nothing was all she had, that was enough. On the morning after the blizzard of 1887, Nell Voss had dug out through 4 feet of packed snow and stood in the pale January light and watched her breath rise in the still cold air. Behind her, the dome stood battered but whole. Inside it, Clem slept under frost-covered blankets in air that held at 16 degrees cold, but not the cold that kills, not anywhere near the cold that kills. She had no money. She had no timber. She had no tools worth naming, and no help worth counting on, and no margin for error, that she had not built herself out of dried grass and bent wire and the 63-year accumulation of understanding what was actually true about the world. She had weeds. She had wire. She had the knowledge that still air holds heat and that the most useless thing in a given landscape is sometimes the only thing that will do. She stood in the pale light and breathed and let the cold sharpen her thinking and looked at the white expanse of the quarter section that was hers. Legally, officially, inarguably hers, and she thought about the next thing that needed to be done. There was always a next thing. That was the truth she had carried for 63 years and would carry for 30 more. The work did not end when the crisis ended. It changed character. It became a different kind of work, the kind you did not to survive, but to build. And the line between those two things was less distinct than people who had never stood on the wrong side of it tended to assume. She went back inside. She woke Clem. She made cornmeal mush from the last of the cornmeal and watched him eat it, all of it, this time. No longer the diminished appetite of fever, but the straightforward hunger of a boy who was awake and intended to stay that way. Outside, the wind began again, gentle at first. The ordinary wind, the background voice of the Nebraska plain, always present, always changing its mind about how hard to blow. The tumbleweed along the eastern fence line shifted and rustled in the new breeze. 200,000 seeds in every plant, already planting the next generation, already preparing to be cursed and pulled and piled and pressed into service again next autumn by whoever was willing to stop long enough to notice what they actually were. Nell washed the cookpot, set it back in its place by the stove, put on her coat. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And she was, by any measure that mattered on the morning of January the 15th, 1887, still here to do it.